Ethan Cole thought he was stealing copper, but that night, he stole his own life instead. In the silent heart of a storm, one desperate thief discovered that some treasures don't glitter in gold, they burn in electricity. Ethan Cole had always lived on the edge of desperation. He wasn't the kind of criminal who planned big heists or dreamed of fortune. He was the kind who stole because he didn't know how else to survive. That night, the air in Brookdale felt heavy and strange, filled with the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. The streets were empty, the lights dim, and Ethan moved like a shadow across cracked pavement. His eyes were fixed on the old warehouse at the end of the industrial strip, a building long abandoned after the factory shut down. Local rumors said it was packed with copper wiring and scrap metal, left behind when the company went bankrupt. To Ethan, it sounded like a gold mine. He had already mapped his way inside, a plan born out of both greed and hunger. The warehouse loomed large, its rusted walls glowing faintly in the lightning flashes that tore through the sky. The broken sign out front still read hazardous materials, but Ethan barely noticed. He slipped through a side entrance where the metal door hung loose on one hinge. Inside, darkness swallowed him whole. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly as it cut through the dust, revealing long rows of forgotten machinery and twisted metal frames. The smell of oil and decay hung thick in the air. Every creak, every soft echo made the space feel alive, like the building was holding its breath. He set his bag down and started to work quickly, using a small cutter to snip away thick copper strands from the wall. The sound of the blades biting through the wire echoed faintly. Each piece clanked as it hit the bottom of his bag. For a while, nothing seemed out of place. It was just another night, another job. But the deeper he moved inside, the more the air seemed to hum around him. The faint vibration made the hair on his arms rise. He stopped and listened, but all he could hear was the rain outside tapping against the broken windows. He shrugged it off and kept cutting, unaware that some of the cables still carried electricity. As the storm built outside, the warehouse itself seemed to pulse with energy, waiting for one wrong move to set everything into motion. The rain outside grew heavier, its rhythmic pounding echoing through the hollow walls like a warning. Ethan worked faster, driven by the thought of how much the copper could fetch. Each strip he pulled loose gleamed in the flickering light of his flashlight, shining like a promise of escape from his miserable life. The storm's distant thunder mixed with the metallic clatter of his tools, creating a strange symphony of danger and greed. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, not realizing how damp the air had become or how close the rainwater was creeping toward his feet through cracks in the concrete floor. As he reached a corner filled with old breaker panels, something unusual caught his eye: a thick bundle of insulated wires running into a steel cabinet marked with faded letters he could barely read. To him, it looked like a jackpot. Copper like that was worth more than a week's wages on the scrap market. Without hesitation, he pried the cabinet open with a rusted screwdriver. Inside, rows of switches and fuses lined the walls like sleeping beasts. A faint electrical hum pulsed through the air, but Ethan's ears, dulled by greed, barely noticed. When he sliced through the first wire, a faint spark snapped in front of his face. It startled him for a moment, but he laughed nervously and brushed it off as static. The second wire gave off a brighter spark, followed by a soft humming sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. The bulb above him, long dead and covered in grime, flickered once then stayed dimly lit. Ethan froze. The warehouse, silent moments ago, seemed to awaken. A low vibration moved through the metal floor, and the smell of ozone filled the air. He backed away slightly, but refused to leave empty-handed. Determined, he reached for another cable. As his cutter clamped down, a sudden flash burst from the wall, throwing light across the entire room. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering as the flashlight slipped from his hand. It rolled away, spinning until it pointed toward the ceiling, revealing thick wires snaking along the beams above him. He realized too late that the power was still alive, coursing through every line he had disturbed. The building groaned in response, its circuits overloading, and in that moment, as thunder roared overhead, the line between luck and disaster grew thinner than the wires he was cutting. Miles away, at the Brookdale power station, a technician leaned over a console that had just started to beep softly. A red indicator light blinked on the old grid map showing Sector 9. That zone hadn't been used in years, and everyone assumed the lines feeding into it were disconnected. The technician made a note to inspect it later, unaware that at that very moment, deep in the warehouse, Ethan was still inside. The storm had reached its peak now, rain pelting the rooftop so hard it sounded like hail. Lightning illuminated the windows in brief, blinding flashes, casting shadows that danced across the metal walls. The entire place felt alive, trembling under the pulse of electricity that shouldn't have been there. Ethan's breathing was sharp and shallow. His nerves were frayed, but his greed kept him moving. He thought he could finish quickly, grab the rest of the copper, and disappear before dawn. The dim bulb above him flickered again, casting eerie patterns across the room. Every flicker made him feel like something was watching him, waiting. He ignored the unease clawing at his gut and started unscrewing an old panel attached to a massive, dust-covered generator. It was half buried in debris, wires coiled around it like vines. He assumed it was useless junk, unaware that it still carried a dormant current, one waiting for the right spark. When his wrench slipped and hit a live terminal, a crack of electricity burst outward, lighting the room in a violent blue glare. The shockwave traveled across the wet floor, leaping through puddles of rainwater. Ethan fell backward, dazed by the sudden noise and light. The power surge rushed through the system, causing distant transformers to groan under the sudden strain. At the power station, another alarm blinked, this time brighter, louder, but the technicians dismissed it as weather interference. Inside the warehouse, smoke began to rise from the floor. The metallic scent of burning filled Ethan's lungs, but he didn't stop. Instead, he crawled toward the scattered copper, desperate to gather what he could before leaving. His hands shook as he reached for the wires again, the storm roaring around him like a living thing. Lightning flashed through a broken skylight, and for a split second, he saw his own reflection in a puddle, distorted, trembling, surrounded by sparks. The warehouse buzzed louder than ever. Then came a blinding flash, a sound like thunder exploding indoors, and everything went dark. When morning broke over Brookdale, the storm had passed, leaving the streets glistening under a pale gray sky. The air felt strangely still, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and something faintly metallic. At the edge of town, a maintenance truck rolled up to the old industrial zone. The utility company had received several overnight reports of flickering lights and low voltage in nearby neighborhoods. Sector 90's old circuit, long thought to be dead, had suddenly drawn massive current before shutting down completely. Two workers stepped out of the truck, their boots sinking into the mud as they approached the warehouse. The front door was slightly ajar, the lock broken clean through. A cold draft drifted from inside, bringing with it a sharp, acrid smell of smoke and burned metal. As they entered, their flashlights sliced through the darkness, revealing devastation frozen in time. The floor was littered with melted copper strands, puddles of blackened water, and fragments of shattered tools. The walls bore dark scorch marks that spread upward like veins of ash. The air was heavy, charged with a faint static that made the hairs on their arms stand up. Near the center of the room, they found a large steel cabinet blown open from the inside, its switches twisted and warped by heat. On the ground beside it lay a pair of gloves, stiff, charred, and still holding the faint shape of human hands. They moved cautiously through the debris, following the path of destruction. A toppled beam lay across the floor, and beneath it, something glinted, a melted fragment of a tool, next to what looked like a half-burned canvas bag fused to the concrete. The men exchanged uneasy looks but said nothing. It was clear this had been no simple electrical fault. One of them radioed for backup, reporting a possible electrocution at the abandoned factory. Within an hour, the site was crawling with investigators and utility engineers, all trying to piece together what had happened. By afternoon, the power station logs confirmed that a sudden surge of more than 20,000 volts had passed through the circuit before it blew. Whoever had been inside hadn't stood a chance. The conclusion was grim but clear. Someone had broken into steel copper and triggered a fatal overload. The story spread quickly through town, whispered in shock and disbelief. The warehouse that had once powered machines now carried the memory of a man who tried to rob it and paid with his life. The investigation wrapped up quietly, but the story refused to die. In small towns like Brookdale, news traveled faster than the wind, and soon everyone was talking about the thief who had met his end in the old factory. The official report labeled it an accidental electrocution due to illegal entry, but locals spoke of it differently. To them, it was more than an accident, it was a warning. Some said Ethan Cole's greed had awakened something in that warehouse, something that didn't take kindly to being disturbed. Others swore that on stormy nights, when lightning flashed over the industrial strip, they could still see faint blue sparks inside the broken windows, like echoes of that deadly night. The power company sealed the building within a week. Heavy chains locked the doors, and yellow warning signs were nailed to every entrance. Danger, high voltage. The boards read in bold letters. Few dared to go near it again. Even utility crews avoided the place unless they absolutely had to. The smell of burnt metal lingered long after the cleanup, clinging to the rusted walls like a memory that refused to fade. Nature began reclaiming the site, weeds pushing through the cracks, vines crawling up the blackened panels, as if trying to bury the evidence of what had happened there. Meanwhile, Ethan's name faded from official records, remembered only by those who had known him as a restless drifter chasing easy money. No one came to claim his belongings, and no family stepped forward. His death was filed, documented, and forgotten except by the people who told his story over and over, each version darker than the last. Children whispered about the electric ghost who haunted the warehouse, saying he roamed the corridors searching for his lost treasure. Adults shook their heads and called it nonsense, but even they avoided the building when the sky turned gray. Months later, a new storm hit Brookdale. Lightning struck near the industrial zone, briefly knocking out the town's power again. When the lights returned, some swore they saw a faint glow on the horizon where the warehouse stood, just for a moment, before it vanished into the rain. Whether it was a trick of the storm or something else, no one ever proved. But one truth remained: Ethan Cole had learned too late that greed can carry a charge, and in Brookdale, electricity never forgets.